All week, Rena listened for the whistle that told her the sardine boat had come in and packers would be needed at the cannery. Rena worked at the cannery for 50 years, and she was the fastest. Snip, flip, and into the can. Nobody could pack more sardines in an hour than she could. It's all in the rhythm, she would say, but everybody has their own rhythm. Ages ago, when she lived outside of town, Rena would get up early and listen for the whistle. Then she would wait for the broken-down makeshift bus that ferried her and a score of other women to the cannery. It rattled noisily down the road, lurching with bad shocks and screeching brakes. Now she lived in town and walked down the hill to the cannery. A chilly dawn mist rolled in from the harbor, wrapping everything in a soft, diffuse light, like an impressionist painting. The factory that made cans for the sardines was off to the left, and the cannery was to the right. Behind the cannery, she could just make out the outline of the wharf and the shape of the sardine boat unloading its catch. As she came nearer, she could hear the sound that permeated every day of her life. As the tide came in, waves lapped at the wharf's supporting timbers, keeping time to the earth's ceaseless cadence as the gulls cried overhead. Wave after wave washed the harbor. They would keep their constant tempo forever. Rena laughed to herself when she thought about Wilson in the shipping department. They had been sweethearts once a long time ago, until the day she caught him eyeing one of the younger cannery workers just out of high school. They saw less of each other after that, until they avoided each other completely. Wilson ended up marrying the younger cannery worker. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. A few years ago, Wilson was promoted to foreman. The next morning, he looked into the mirror and decided something was missing. A tie. He'd come up in the world, and he needed to wear a tie to work. When he walked in the door to the cannery, the ladies packing sardines gave him the side-eye. "What's he wearing a tie for?" asked Rena. "Who does he think he is? Something special?" smirked Ruth. "Yep, he got promoted to foreman yesterday. Now he thinks he's a big shot," said Mona. Rena laid out a challenge. "Well, ladies, we can't let this go unanswered." They waited until he was just walking past their table, waiting to punch the tickets, tracking how many sardines they packed. Then they tackled him and laid him out on his back with his tie drooping to the floor. Someone found a hammer and a 10-penny nail nearby and drove the nail through the tie into the rough wooden floor, wet with runoff and fish guts. "That'll teach him to get uppity," laughed Rena. The packing floor was well known for such pranks. More than one lunchbox had been glued to a bench, waiting for its owner to rush by and grab it, hurrying to lunch. Rarely were there any serious repercussions for such horseplay, because good, speedy packers were valuable. And they were loyal. Back during the 40s, the cannery owner took a contract to supply the U.S. Army with sardines for the soldiers' rations. The packers worked for 6 months packing crate after crate of sardines. They didn't get paid until the Army paid its contract after the sardines were shipped by rail. No one complained. They just kept packing. Arriving at the cannery that morning, Rena put on what looked like a plastic shower cap and a plastic apron. She taped up her bony fingers to guard against mishaps with the scissors, then took up her station at the table as the sluice gate was opened and sardines began moving down one conveyor belt and 3x4-inch cans down a parallel belt. Snip, flip, and into the can, all day long for 50 years. She could no longer smell the sardines, but her grandchildren could. They refused to eat the cookies she baked. "They smell like sardines, Grandma." For the past 5 years, there had been less and less work at the cannery because of competition from Norwegian fishing boats. They could catch more sardines, freeze them, and sell them to markets at prices that undercut the local sardine boats and the cannery. Once, there were 75 canneries up and down the coast of Maine. Now, there was only one left. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. When the sardine industry was booming, the packers worked 10 and 12-hour days until the fish were gone. The fish wouldn't keep overnight in a building without temperature control. Now, at piecework wages, Rena barely made enough to live on. During the winter, she survived on unemployment checks when the sardine boats didn't go out. As the line slowed down and stopped shortly after 1 in the afternoon, Rena sighed to her workmates. "Looks like this is going to be a short day." "Ain't no more fish coming down the conveyor belt," agreed Mona. "I only packed half as much as I packed last Wednesday," grumbled Ruth. "How am I going to pay my grocery bill on that?" It was cool out, so Rena put on her jacket and walked the half-mile up the hill to her small house. It was still too early to begin planting the garden, so she began tackling some of the spring cleaning. Wiping the dust and soot from the woodwork, she glanced at the framed, faded newspaper article on the wall. It included a photograph of the cannery owner and the packers standing in front of the plant on the day the new cannery opened 15 years earlier. The old plant burned down one night when some flammable materials were left in a closet. Firemen worked through the night, but the fire was fed by barrels of oil that were used in packing the sardines. The exploding barrels could be heard all over town. Fewer packers were hired in the current season. There had been rumors that the cannery would not make it through to the fall. Tastes had changed in the last 30 years. Workmen once packed a can of sardines with mustard or hot sauce in their lunchbox, but few did these days. Why didn't anyone want to eat sardines anymore? She worried about the rumors she'd been hearing. A month ago, a small group of men were seen touring the cannery. Someday there's going to be a padlock on that door, she thought. The next week, the whistle blew on a Thursday morning, but when Rena walked down the hill, she was puzzled because she didn't see any sardine boats in the harbor. Why did they blow the whistle if there ain't no sardines? Shortly after she entered the plant, the owners called all the workers into the main room. "I want to thank all of you who have worked so hard over the years to keep this cannery operating. I will always remember each and every one of you and all of your efforts. Yesterday, we had to make a very hard decision. We cannot operate this cannery beyond this week in the current environment. It is no longer economically viable." Gasps shuddered through the assembly. Mona reached for her handkerchief, but Rena was not particularly surprised. She had expected it. Still, it was as if someone had died. Rena remembered the months they had worked without pay to feed the soldiers. She remembered the night the plant burned down, with the sad faces of the workers the next morning, viewing the still smoking ashes and charred timbers, and vowing with the owner to rebuild the plant. And they did. Now it was gone. The heart of the town was gone, and people would start to leave. 3 months later, 2 of her neighbors packed up and left town, looking for work elsewhere. 2 months after that, the small diner on Water Street closed, along with the drugstore. They were replaced by a gift shop for tourists and a coffee shop. The tavern was turned over to new owners who remodeled and built a deck with a view of the ocean, seeking to attract summer visitors. Weeks later, Rena took the framed newspaper article off the wall and packed it in a worn, half-crumpled grocery store box, along with some clothes, a few photos, and some knickknacks. Tomorrow, her niece would drive her to a retirement home in Bangor, inland, where she would no longer hear the waves lapping against the wharf. That afternoon, Rena walked down the hill to take one last look at the old cannery. She listened for the rhythm of the waves lapping against the wharf, but the tide had gone out. She lifted her head and looked to her right. There it was, the padlock on the door. She understood that change was as inevitable as the waves against the wharf. The tide comes in, and the tide goes out.